بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وثبت أقدامنا. لقد كنا من الظالمين فنتوجه إليك ونستغفر الله ونتوب إليك سبحانك لا إله إلا أنت. أما بعد, a couple of months ago, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Hussein, who's a notable voice within the circle of scholars of Sham, specifically the Jordan region, he was asked a question with regard to Athari based texts which have some receptivity within Ashari circles. He was asked with regard to why it is that those texts are not made part of the mainstream popular curriculum that Ashari students study, why those texts are eliminated. Of note are like the books of Imam al-Bayhaqi, but there are a number of other Musnad texts that have an isnad and are actually more substantiated as far as the isnad ijazah system than some of the books in kalam, some of the books in philosophical theology. Also, it was asked about the books of Imam al-Lalakai al-Shafi'i, which is an encyclopedic text on Aqida, and it is rooted in the Naqli Athari orientation. It's a book that is accepted by all. And we know the book of Imam al-Sabuni, whose text is currently promoted more within Salafi circles than it is within Ashari circles. The response that he gave was less than realistic or less than grounded in the reality of the situation from a knowledge angle. If we go back to the teachings of Dr. Hassan Abdul Latif al-Shafi'i al-Azhari, who's one of the great living Kalam scholars of today's time within the circuit of the scholars of Al-Azhar. He's one of the co-founders of the Institute for the Study of Imam Abul Hasan al-Ashari in Al-Azhar al-Sharif. He was a founder of the Islamic International University of Pakistan. He established it in about 6 years. And he sits on the Council of the Arabic Language, and he has a lot to his credit, not only as a scholar, but as a leader and a community organizer with regard to the issues of knowledge. There's a lot to be said about his background. But he mentioned in his writings that there was a turn that was taken within Ashari thought, which moved away from the original inclination of Imam Abil Hasan al-Ashari himself, which was to keep in balance الدليل النقلي والدليل العقلي, to keep in balance the rational proof and the textual proof, or the transmitted proof. And so what we see in the post Fakhruddin al-Razi age, within the circle of Ashari thinking that's popular, not necessarily overall in the sense of what's actually taking place, because there's no way that we can actually account for what is taking place in every sphere, every geographical sphere. But what we see as far as popularity, what gains attention, is that in the post Fakhruddin al-Razi age, where Ashari Kalam went through a philosophical reformation, meaning that it was reformed and it moved away from its initial intuitions or its initial orientations and became much more philosophical, different historical epoch or period, different set of concerns, different methodology even. Imam Fakhr, in many ways, aligned Ashari thinking with that of the Mu'tazila at a level that was unprecedented. Of course, with its Sunni thobe or its Ashari thobe, it took on a Sunni type of orientation. But it was removed from giving weight to a dalil al-naqli, Abu Hassan Ashari's methodology, especially we saw that in Al-Ibana and other books. And the general opinion in Al-Azhar al-Sharif is that Al-Ibana belongs to Imam Abil Hasan al-Ashari. There's some dispute over about 2 or 3 lines in the text, but overall, it falls exactly in line with the thinking of Imam Abil Hasan al-Ashari, and Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i considers it to be representative of the Naqli trend in the Ashari school that sits aside the Aqli trend, the transmission or transmitted or Athari trend or tendency, sitting aside the rationalist tendency. And both are representative of a Sunni type of thinking, right? Of a Sunni type of thinking. We're not going to say totally Athari bent, because that's not the case at all, but it's a Sunni type of thinking that marries the two realities together. When we talk about Aqida studies in a general non-sectarian way, that's how we classify that. With that said, understanding that historical shift is important, because at the end of the day, what takes place is that the ramifications of that historical knowledge shift away from focusing on transmitted evidences to the inclination which leans highly to the philosophical speculative mode, means that the curriculum is going to be impacted. And so we find another thing that takes place that's not spoken of highly is that there are popular texts within the Ashari school, like Jawharat al-Tawheed, like Al-Kharida. These types of texts have a certain position within the Ashari school. And they have a tendency also to merge with Sufi thought. So these texts lay down the foundations for what later on will be manifest or made more clear within Sufi practice, especially when you start talking about things like Qadr and otherwise. There's a certain type of orientation that is there that opens up to make the merger between Sufi thinking and ilm al-kalam much more easy. We saw that Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayhi spoke to that point, the limits of kalam and opening up to the way of intuition, the way of experience, the way of tasting or dhok. And so the position that Dr. Abdul Qadir Hussein took in reality dismisses a notable shift within Ashari thought, which eventually led to more acceptance of rationalist philosophical thinking. And this, in reality, this spirit, this attitude was widespread in the Muslim world, and it had led to a near, not total, but a near abandonment of the study of hadith. And that tension was there earlier on, and you can see that tension between Ibn Salah, Imam Ibn Salah, the Muhaddith, the Faqih, and the Faqih Mujtahid Izzuddin Abdul Salam, both within the Ashari umbrella. The conversation, even though it is not always a direct conversation, between Izzuddin Abdul Salam and Ibn Salah is recorded. And note that I said it's not always a direct conversation, but when you look at the writings of the two, you can piece together an exchange between the two tendencies within the Ashari school. And so the way of the muhaddithin within the Ashari school became minimized. And so the problem of curriculum, the reason why these books are not taught exactly, or they're just referred to periodically, like was done by someone like Said Foda, Dr. Said Foda, in his commentary, or not even commentary, his notes on some points within the Aqida, one of the texts of Aqida of Imam al-Bayhaqi. It's just in passing, and it's just referred to attempt to refute or dismiss the Salafi project, which is to revive Athari Aqida, or the Aqida of those who are Ahl al-Hadith in part, and more specifically, the direction of the followers of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab within that. We should not confuse the two realities always as being one. The Salafist tendency is not always equal to the school of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. But in any event, Abdul Qadir Hussein, in that regard, didn't account for the reality of methodological shift. The Mu'tazila were initially that group which began to question at a level that the dismissal of the Sunnah became something that was a near mainstay, or to at least criticize and put down, and there's varying levels of that. And the highlighting and the praising and the encouraging and the liking of rational discourse became the hallmark of the Mu'tazila. The shift that Imam Abil Hasan al-Ashari introduced into that vein of thinking, or that circle between the Mu'tazila and the philosophers, was to tone down the rationalist tendency and to inject the Athari tendency, or the textual tendency, and bring more of a balance. And we see that in curriculum and what books are chosen and read, at times the Ashari school is shifted in different directions. And we can see these projects. There's a scholar from Al-Hind who, if we look at it, at Taftazani is almost like a merger between Ashari and Maturidi Aqida or methodologies. And we see there's a scholar from Al Hind that blends that with Ibn Arabi's thinking. So what you begin to see is a tendency emerge where you have the marriage of different ideas and they create a tendency of thought within Aqida studies and within Sufi thought. I use that example to say that within Ashari thought there's variation, and we don't get to see that reality or understand it very well because the way that Aqidah is being taught in today's time is more sectarian than it is knowledge based in the sense of understanding how ideas form and how positions are constructed and how tendencies emerge, and then eventually how schools of thought are formed. And so that it's not just a matter of curriculum from the angle of what is just studied, as Abdul Qadir Hussein mentioned, Amrun Darasi. This is just a matter of, okay, this is what's in the curriculum, this is what we study. No, there's an actual methodological inclination away from looking at those types of books. And the problem is that many of those books that are Musnad texts, whether it's the Aqidah of Saboni or whether it is the books of Al Bayhaqi or whether it is uh, some of the texts that are introduced in the earlier phases of Ashari Aqidah, or whether it is the book of Lalakai and a number of other Musnad texts that are Athari based. If those books were studied, you would see much more of a toning down of the sectarian differences than we would go into the realm of masail or issues that are debated, more so than an actual outright clash between methodologies. The failure to revive the Athari tendency, it says a lot about the state of knowledge. In fact, many of the books that are Athari representations within the Ashari school have been revived by those with the Salafi, even more specifically those that are following the school of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab. The universities that have dedicated themselves to that type of leadership that's supportive of the school of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, they have devoted time and effort so that these manuscripts can come to light. That says a lot about the stage of knowledge. But in reality, Dr. Hassan al-Shafi, a leading Ashari scholar, and I want to close with this. When he was commissioned by Dr. Ahmed Tayyib, who's the rector of Al-Azhar al-Sharif, to do a commentary and to teach the book Lum'a by Imam Abil Hassan al-Ashari, Dr. Hassan al-Shafi'i commented that the state of Ashari thinking in reality is in a poor state when we look at the books of Abil Hassan al-Ashari that have reached us. There's little effort that has been put into them to really comment on them and to critically edit them. There's some editions that are good, but the work went into neglect. The work of Abil Hassan al-Ashari was neglected by the Ashari school itself. Not only the work of Abil Hassan, but you find the earliest of those scholars from that school, whether it is Baqalani or a number of others, the work that has been placed on that is very limited. And ironically, when you look at the work of Ibn Taymiyyah has a strong place for people like Imam al-Baqilani in his thinking. With that said, there's a necessity for us to pull back or pull away from sectarian thinking and have an understanding of what is actually taking place among the Muslims. Because with civilizational decline comes a lot of infighting and misunderstanding, but also a lack of appreciation for the contribution of the scholars of Islam. And this is a time period where we should be able to appreciate the contributions that have been made by those scholars. So, although what is popular at times is thought to be authoritative or the only thing that should be referenced, the reality is quite different. And so, the Athari tendency within the Ashari school, it exists, but it has been neglected within the Ashari circles, and that has led to a great gap between different groups due to that reason. The rationalist tendencies now, where you see that more and more people are going to, and they're doing so in such a way that they're indicating a lack of mastery of Islamic thought. So they jump on one tendency or another tendency of thinking, and instead of understanding the reasons why these tendencies emerge and the purpose behind them, they automatically go into a clash of orthodoxy. What is orthodox? What's not orthodox? And confusion arises in Aqida studies because you have a lot of students talking on issues that they don't really understand. Foundations of Aqida are clear and universal. How we deal with those matters that fall outside of the foundations is a matter of discussion. How we understand those discussions says a lot about what kind of students that we are. And one of the things that's necessary to understand is that in the core of Aqidah, there's no confusion. It's in the matters in which there can present itself more than one position, whether over a text of hadith if it's used or not, or whether an ayah of Quran if it has more than one meaning, or how do we choose between meanings. It's in those realms that there's discussions. And if we understood the principles, the qawaid, the aqidah, and the principles of usul al-fiqh and language and so on and so forth, and how language works, we would be in a better place to discuss these issues. But because methodologically many of us are deficient in talking about things at a higher level, and we lack the manners of the students of knowledge, we fall into sectarian inclinations, and we're not really able to outline why there are differences. And the things that can bring us together, like the study of these types of Athari texts, are the least of the concern of those teaching Aqidah. And so it shows also that there's a negligence in understanding Quranic principles, referring to the Jama'ah and to the Ummah, and to the lessening of those factors which cause division among the Muslims. And instead of bringing understanding and a resolution of the various conflicts in knowledge that exists in reality, what we do is we heighten and strengthen those conflicts and sharpen them, but really not knowing how to handle differences of opinion. And with that, we close, people. We ask Allah Ta'ala to aid us and to bring us in a position of understanding and to open up the gates by which we can pass to gain the pleasure of Allah wa ta'ala and to be granted forgiveness from Allah wa ta'ala. We ask Allah for protection from our own selves and from any evil that exists in the world. And we ask for the Muslims in their entirety and for those that are oppressed throughout the world, that Allah wa ta'ala aid and guide them. And we ask for those that have gone before us in Iman and for those that are sick, that Allah wa ta'ala alleviate and lighten their burdens. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. السلام عليكم.